So welcome everybody. I think folks will keep on joining us as we progress through the first little bit of the seminar. So just a quick introduction for those of you who don't know me. I think most of you do. Well, my name is Jan van Aert. I'm a professor in imaging science here at RIT. And it's really my privilege today to introduce not only a colleague and an expert in the field of LiDAR, but a dear friend of mine, Dr. Sorin Popescu. Sorin and I go back, goodness, Sorin, many years, 20, 25 years almost. I guess 1996, 97.
More than 2 decades, yes.
Yeah. We both were graduate students at Virginia Tech in the Forestry department under Dr. Randy Wynn. And Sorin was Randy's first PhD student. And I think I was third or so, I don't recall exactly. And Sorin has since gone on to become, in all earnest, one of the preeminent LiDAR experts in the country and even internationally, working across the range of scales from terrestrial, drone, airborne, and even space-borne LiDAR. In fact, Sorin serves on the current ISAT-2 science team, which is a pretty cool accomplishment in that it's a very competitive program to serve on one of these science teams, but it also speaks to his stature in the field. So it really is a privilege to me to introduce him today. And I'm actually excited about the talk because you often find yourself working in a field and you don't always realize what you're busy with until someone verbalizes it properly. And I really liked Sorin's description in his bio, which I will leave to you to go read all the detail. But he's essentially saying through combining elements of technoecology, which is a pretty neat term if you think about that, technoecology, ecoinformatics, and remote sensing with advanced Earth imaging technology, LiDAR, and novel data analytics, Dr. Popescu's research and teaching interests meet the need of the next generation scientists to address increasingly complex ecological research questions and challenges from local to global scales. It's a mouthful, but if you really dissect that statement, it's really neat to see the marriage of physics and biology, of sensing and ecology, and how it's being used to address some of these really pressing questions from climate change to land use change to invasive species, etc. So without further ado, I'm gonna hand over the mic to Sorin, and I just want to say thanks, Sorin, for taking some time out of a busy schedule to spend with us, and I very much look forward to the talk.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you everyone for joining in and for listening to this talk. It's a pleasure to reconnect with Jan as always, and to talk to you. It's been, I think, 8 years since I gave an in-person seminar at RIT, if I'm not mistaken, Jan, and I thoroughly enjoyed visiting your group there, your school, and interacting with your students at that time and faculty as well. So now it's through Zoom. It's the signature of the COVID times, I guess. I'm glad to talk to you again. And the topic I chose when I was asked for a title on this was something that has preoccupied me for a while. Like Dr. Van Aert mentioned, we are trying to define ourselves and what we're doing. And for a long time, I just thought I was doing remote sensing. And then I realized, coming across some papers, that in fact, I'm doing beyond that. And knowing your interests in imaging science that spans, a variety of disciplines, and the way we acquire images and the way we share them and process them, I thought this may be of interest to you all. So without further ado, so I'm a professor now at Texas A&M University. I've been in the same department basically for 18 years, but the title has gone from forest science to ecosystem science and management, and now we are ECCB, which is ecology and conservation biology. So just like we try to define ourselves as scientists, you see departments are doing the same thing, and sometimes the wording changes a little. The slides I'm going to present the results of my research and my lab research. In fact, it's owes a lot of acknowledgement to the group I work with. So first, I'll start by acknowledging the invitation. Thank you to Dr. Van Aert and Lou for inviting me to give this seminar. but then to my current and former members of my lab. So these are just the current members here, and some that have contributed to the kind of research I'm trying to convey to you here in one slide only. So to summarize the research interests that I've been involved with, a lot of LiDAR three-dimensional mapping, and that's really great for generating 3D models of trees at various scales, from individual trees to global scales. In fact, maps of tree height or vegetation height. So mapping biomass and carbon. Then given the three-dimensional structure of LiDAR, you can look at various heights above ground with the same idea of taking computer tomography images. So looking through the canopy space at various height intervals or through various slices allows someone to characterize the three-dimensional structure and relate that to a variety of interesting ecological metrics, such as habitat would be a basic one, from fuel models to characterizing the canopy space by looking at leaf area index, canopy cover, and so forth. Recent projects since the advent of UAVs about, well, they have been doing remote sensing for a long time, but they have become mainstream for about the last decade, I'd say. And we had several projects here, some of them going outside of my usual natural resources type of vegetation, down to crops, agricultural crops. And we were looking at phenotyping studies by, in fact, being able to process UAV images and point clouds and identify individual plants. So measuring those individual plants, measuring panicles, like for sorghum panicles, and linking those measurements to yield and to biomass, depending on the interest there. So that's something that I think these days some of you may be interested in, processing those large amounts of UAV data in multiple disciplines. So another aspect that I was interested through decades was this merging of terrestrial, airborne, and space-borne LiDAR data for assessing vegetation biophysical parameters. And as Jan mentioned, for the past, I think it's about 6 years now, I've been involved with the science team. On this slide, I'm using the old name, the science definition team, but after the satellite was launched, it has become the science team. Prior, it was just for defining the science that could have been accomplished through this satellite. So my interests are the same under this mission, trying to characterize vegetation 3D structure with photon counting LiDAR data that's collected by ISA2. Ever since grad school, I've been involved with algorithm development for processing remote sensing data, including LiDAR data. And I'll show you some of the latest small, I would say, software developments that are able to let us look into photon counting LiDAR. And then machine learning applications, processing from LiDAR to UAV images to spaceborne satellite images has been part of my interest. And that's for various reasons. Like I said, mapping fuels and even habitat that I not mentioned here. So that was in a nutshell a lot of my research interests. So let's go now to define this term that I found a pretty strong connection with, technoecology. So 2 years ago or 3 years ago now, this paper came up, future casting ecological research, the rise of technoecology. And when I came across that, it really dawned on me that a lot of my research interest, in fact, could be under this umbrella of technoecology. So given the fact that the research complex, the research questions in ecology are becoming more and more complex. The global challenges are really growing in importance, and they become more and more obvious in the public domain through global change, biodiversity loss. They are all driving rapid development and refinement of technologies to assess Earth and assess where ecology, global ecology, or from local to global scales, in fact, ecological aspects are standing. So this was the paper that stimulated my interest in now more defined technoecology field. And here is a timeline to show the technologies that have been used in ecology and environmental science. And it goes back to the 1950s with, starting with sonar, automated sensors, mainframe computers in those days, the launch of the Landsat mission back in the early 70s. And then we start having lidar developments initially as just profile sensors acquiring data strictly under the airplane, which resulted in a profile of three-dimensional structure. And then GPS became available, three-dimensional lidar scanning side to side later on in the 2000. We later on, we started talking about UAVs, automated or autonomous vehicles going from air, space even, and down into oceans. And these days, future technology that already has some implementations could include, of course, 3D printing, low power computers, but even more interesting sensors and observations such as biobatteries. So using, in fact, trees to generate electricity, and power sensors, mapping molecular movement, and having everything connected. It's what seems to be the future of technoecology. And I bet that some of you, through your interests, you may find yourself somewhere on this environmental science arrow here, from whatever, from, I guess, given the interest that Jan mentioned, you have a really broad, diverse, multidisciplinary approach with imaging that could be, in fact, used in any aspect, not just ecology, but I think this may raise some thoughts into where you are and what you're doing. So my interest lies strongly into LiDAR technology, which it's probably one of the most accurate technology to provide the 3D ecosystem structure. And then unmanned sensor platforms to collect ecological data automatically, remotely, including in terrain that is difficult to access or dangerous. But not just that, such technology, autonomous vehicles, drones, they allow us to collect data that was previously missing from our tools of looking at ecology and Earth, such as very high frequency time series of data customized to your needs, which was impossible to collect with satellite data or even airborne platforms, given the cost or just the way the technology works. For future, these are a few items that really made me pause. So Internet of Things, okay? A network of devices that can communicate with one another, transferring information and processing data. So imagine having your sensors, your cameras, or even sound recording devices that can record bird songs out in some remote area. And having everything transferred and processed, and the ecologists now sitting in the office receiving such data or the results of processing and being able to draw conclusions. Low power computers that can stay out in the field and run algorithms and statistical analysis. This swarm theory of having coordinated unmanned sensor platforms to complete ecological surveys. In fact, not too long ago, in collaboration with some mechanical engineers here at Texas A&M, we received some NSF funds to develop a autonomous flight for drones, observing the line of fires and adjusting their flight and sending data to the ground to have real-time observations from above the forest fires. In this idea, again, of coordinated unmanned sensor platforms that send information down to someone who takes decisions. 3D printing, I'm sure you probably have some 3D printers even at your workplace there or in the department. Mapping molecular movement. I'll jump to some that are a bit more interesting. Those biobatteries, having sensors and electrobiochemical devices in remote areas powered by non-traditional energy sources that can power those sensors that send data to someone analyzing them in a lab. So those technologies, can be integrated in creating this smart research environment. And again, if you look at this diagram here, you may be the person sitting in the top right corner there at your office, receiving data from the field, from all those multiple technologies that work together in a smart, connected way, and allowing you to draw conclusions and allowing you to process a huge amount of data that has been traditionally the bottleneck in remote sensing. We receive this data from sensors, from satellite, every single day. But even with machine learning and artificial intelligence, eventually there is an operator that looks over the results and draws conclusion. But the volume of data keeps growing, and eventually to keep up with such volume of data, we need to involve all of this connected research environment. So I mentioned artificial intelligence, already. So it's one of the trending aspects in ecological research, and the areas that could benefit the most are modeling and simulation, combining qualitative with quantitative knowledge, developing new theories, and managing natural resources. At the bottom, I have a few publications from my research group here that used either deep learning to identify, count, and measure sorghum panicles in the phenotyping study I mentioned earlier, and then the same for mapping biomass with space-borne photo counting data. So knowing that some of you have interest in visualizations as well, before I introduce you to some of the research projects, I thought I would run you through some visualization that, in fact, a student created in my graduate class, where I required them to create a visualization of various vegetated environments. So this one, it's airborne lidar data. You see every single shot, it's a 3D XYZ coordinate that's resulted from interaction of airborne lidar with forests, with trees. And the same area now, but this time scanned from the ground with a terrestrial lidar system that we have at the lab here, just for you to understand the type of data, the complexity, and the way you could fuse data from multiple platforms, from the ground, terrestrial, and later on space-borne. I'll show you another example. Okay, so getting into some of the research that I'm doing currently here, I'll introduce you to ISAT-2 if you are not familiar with it. It was a space-borne satellite launch in 2018, towards the end of 2018, with the main science objective of quantifying polar ice sheets and understanding whether we're dealing with accumulation of loss of ice given the climate change we're going through. But when it operates on land, of course, that measurement of 3 dimensions could very well apply to measuring vegetation canopy heights as the basis for mapping vegetation parameters globally and getting to better estimate the carbon sequestered in trees worldwide. So for the first time, it was a photon counting lidar sensor launched into orbit. So the name tells you that it's able to count individual photons that match the wavelength of the lidar that's sent down to the ground and received back at the satellite receiver. And you may imagine that, you know, there's light, especially during the day, that may match the same wavelength. So one of the key processing aspects is to separate noise from, you know, mostly having solar electromagnetic radiation of the same wavelength from the actual photons emitted by ISAT-2. So there are many applications, mostly related to ice and whether sea ice or inland glaciers, but a lot of them are dealing with, a lot of the interest deals with assessing vegetation biophysical parameters. This is the type of data that's produced. So the satellite, in fact, operates by sending 6 beams, 3 strong beams and 3 weak beams, spaced about 3 kilometers apart. And over every track of those beams, there's a footprint illuminated every 70 centimeters. So a long track, it's a very dense pattern of observations, of measurements. And across track, those beams are spaced every 3 kilometers. Towards the bottom, you see how the raw lidar data looks like. And you can pretty easily guess that you're looking at the terrain surface there towards the bottom. Then you see the trees on top, the vegetation, with a higher density of points where the canopy is located. And then both at the top and at the bottom of that image, you see noise. So there are photons of the same wavelengths that are below or above the actual data. Okay, so that's why, as I mentioned earlier, the first need for processing is to filter that noise out. The data products are varied. It goes from land ice height, sea ice freeboard, sea ice elevation, inland water elevation, ocean elevation, and so forth. You can find more about it on the NASA ISAT-2 page. But my interest here is what's called ATL-08. which is land, water, vegetation, elevation. Okay, and guess what? Despite the mission primary objective being characterization of ice sheets, the most downloaded data by a pretty large margin, it's in fact the vegetation data. So there's very strong interest in this ADL08 product. So just like with MODIS products, if you are familiar with it, instead of offering scientists just raw data like for example, the typical Landsat image, but even Landsat offers products such as normalized difference vegetation index and so forth. So to allow easier adoption by scientists and easier use of such data for ecological research, NASA provides those standard products, in this case ATL08, that gives for every 100-meter segment along the track of those beams, it gives various statistical measures of vegetation height. This is the envisioned coverage of ISAT2 data across, I'm showing here just the northern part of Canada here and a little bit of the US. But imagine that over the whole globe. And of course, sometimes you have various conditions that will not allow the collection of good data, such as clouds or whatever other issues with noise or issues with pointing of the satellite and so forth. But most of those have been taken care of, except weather, right? But eventually we will have a coverage of ISAT2 profiles like the one I showed over the whole globe that looks like this. And this is after the 2-year mission, but no, it can stay in orbit well beyond that. So hopefully we'll increase the coverage even more, and we'll start repeating coverage to look at change over vegetation as well. We right now have a manuscript in review that's looking at processing and validation of this ISAT2 data by comparing it to airborne lidar data that's already an accepted technology for providing ground and canopy heights. So without going into all of these details, I just summarize what we're doing. And in fact, we're looking at multiple ecoregions in the US, and they are shown here on this graph. And we're looking at comparing how good the weak and the strong beams correlate to airborne lidar elevations. And the interest is to better really understand how close it comes to characterizing those vegetation heights. We have on GitHub, the first author, it's the research scientist that worked with me at the lab here, Lonesome Malambo. Some of these graphs are due to him, so I give him full credit for them. He came up with a Photon Labeler and Photon visualization tool that's available on GitHub. The reason it's called Photon Labeler is because we wanted to have some of those photons manually labeled and then use machine learning and deep learning methods with those labeled sample data to, in fact, allow processing and classification of those photons into whether they are canopy photons, top of canopy, canopy between top and ground, or ground photons. So that's the interest in classifying the photons, and for that we needed large amounts of labeled photon data, and that's why we came up with this Photon Labeler. It's available for download. if you are interested in it, and you can also visualize data such as the image that you see at the top there, where we display the classified and the raw data from running this software. So I'll show you some examples of ISAT2 data. To top left here, you have the raw photon data compared to airborne LiDAR data. So you clearly see the patterns. Of course, airborne LiDAR, much denser observations. The Photon Labeler allows direct link to web map products, so you can see where those tracks are located. We were very surprised initially to see that the photon LiDAR data penetrates water, and that's why there are some of the scientists on the science team at NASA that work on inland water and seawater as well for bathymetric applications. So as you see bottom left here, it's pretty obvious that we are able to map or to look at the bottom of some of those lakes. Grand Canyon, I was talking to Malambo, and we thought for fun, let's just look at some of the landmarks, such as, let's look at New York City to see how the data looks over the urban jungle there. Let's look over the Grand Canyon. So this is what I'm showing you here at the top. And then also for some other interests, some other projects that we have, mapping semi-arid vegetation in Texas here, we wanted to see how well we can portray such vegetation with the lower canopy cover and lower heights to see how we can identify such heights on ISAT2 data. Tropical forests here, much more complex forest environment in Brazil, the desert dunes in Niger, and some nice tall redwood forests in Sonoma County in California. So what I'm showing you here, it's the airborne LiDAR strip and the photon LiDAR data that's located within that strip. And just for visualizing and better understanding how the photon LiDAR data falls within the airborne LiDAR representation there. Same thing here, this time with a 3D view, and we were really blown away and very pleasantly surprised to see the photons. They are more clear bottom right of this image. If you look somewhere in this area, I even have the feeling like it follows the profile of some of those huge trees there, so which was pretty interesting and reassuring to see that those photons from space can in fact characterize pretty well the vegetation height. Zoom into this, showing you the same thing, and the same, okay. The footprint on the ground is about 14 meters, so that's why we cut a strip of airborne LiDAR data that's about 14-meter wide. But those photons could come basically from anywhere within that footprint, but we map their location to the center of the footprint. So that's why occasionally you may see some misalignment possibly of heights, given the fact that we map those photons to the center of the footprint, but they could come from anywhere within that footprint. So as I mentioned earlier, we have interest. So NASA provides that ATL08 product that's already classified photon data, but we did not want to rely just on the NASA product and came up with our own algorithm shown here to filter out noise and then classify photons in top of canopy, and ground. And These are results of our own algorithm, some visualizations of such profiles. This is how it actually works. So the first part here, it's filtering out the noise, and then the second part, without going into all sorts of details, is the photon classification part itself, and that's described in a publication in RSC. But since then, this is a 2-year-old publication. We constantly modified and improved this algorithm, and I think results are much better now. This is how it works. So if you can see this animation here, we are looking at those moving windows and analyze photons in those moving windows and decide whether they are noise or top of canopy or ground. Once we have those photons classified, we can look at many other ecological applications. I'm showing you an example here that has been published by my PhD student, Meng Liu. He looked at recent wildfires in California, the Car Fire from August 2018, and we basically map burnt area by looking at the structure of those photons, the 3D structure for unburned and burnt area, and we were able to identify burnt areas on those vertical profiles. Another related study was mapping biomass, and here is an example of creating and upscaling an above-ground biomass map using those ISET2 transects that intersected for some part, an airborne lidar map of biomass, and then was scaled up. I'll go now through some examples of UAS or drone research that we have done at the lab here. We have a suite of drones, including one that has a lidar sensor on it. And this semester, we are teaching, both Malambo and I were co-teaching this class that's here. It has the old title, Unmanned Aerial Systems for Remote Sensing. The new title is Drones for Environmental Remote Sensing. So we dare to call them drones, in fact, but that seems to be a term that's more commonly accepted these days, rather than the FAA term UAS that some may still question what that really means. So we in this course, we start with US regulations, then with flight planning, image processing and analysis that includes structure from motion techniques, creating orthorectified products, creating point clouds, and then processing those products. So US-based mapping and 3D modeling of those point clouds, including elements of computer vision. Some of the research results that we publish here at the lab. The top left here, I'm showing you monitoring plant growth, which provided some really interesting conclusions. Again, if you're not familiar with the way measurements are collected in the field for agriculture, basically we've seen that we witness, someone is taking a pole or some other measuring tape and usually eyeballing what the crop height is, but we were able to do that going down to plant level, and this was interesting from a phenotyping perspective. So some collaborators that are corn or sorghum breeders, they plant all these genetic materials, and they want to assess and monitor the growth from various varieties of sorghum like that, to better understand which ones should be selected for breeding and for planting in future generations. So that's what we did. We monitored the growth over an entire growing season with flights that were most of the times weekly flights or bi-weekly, sometimes even more frequent flights to characterize the growth. And we observed some interesting patterns that were helpful for the breeders. Top right here, we wanted to look at lidar versus UAV point clouds and the estimation of the number of plants and measurement of their panicles, which is something, again, that hasn't been accomplished very rarely on the ground. Nobody is willing to measure too many of those given, the plant density in a crop field. Same thing, bottom left here, we use some machine learning methods to identify every panicle visible on those UAV images, and the overall detection accuracy was 94%, which turned out to be pretty impressive, I'd say. Similar research with UAVs is conducted in semi-arid areas of Texas. And the interest in that from an ecological viewpoint is the fact that due to climate change, that semi-arid border, so to speak, or meridian, it's moving east. So we've seen some severe droughts lately in Texas, and even in this area, so where I'm located, which is East Texas. So it's a really solid interest in understanding where that semi-arid region is actually, or border is located, and the fact that it seems to be moving east, and understanding the effects on plants, the effects on herbivores, and the very many complex ecological factors that are observed these days with such technology, including, for example, the woody plant encroachment, change in the native grass habitat, and overcoming of such habitats with woody plants such as mesquite and cedar, which it has strong implications, not only from a natural ecology perspective, but think about the grazing areas that we rely on to produce a lot of the beef in Texas, for example, in such areas. So I'll end up with this project that turned out to be more complex than we initially thought. Mapping of forest attributes using a synergy of multiple remote sensing platforms and data sets. And the project started with funding from International Paper, which is a private company that offered us a grant to look into ways to improve inventory, decrease uncertainty with our forest inventory. And we proposed this approach of using, from terrestrial data to lidar data to drones, and all the way up to the ISAT-2 data. So they have multiple study areas in Texas and Louisiana. They have measurements of volume from their logging there. And by using such data, we're trying to see how close we can come and in what ways we can assist with improving forest inventory estimates. So we started with mapping stem volume, with the airborne lidar data, and then linking those maps to space-borne lidar. You see this pattern to the right here of ISAT-2 tracks, and our attempts to map volume wall to wall, and lastly, compare our volume estimates to forest inventory and analysis, which is the USDA Forest Service inventory program. And for counties in Texas here, if you look at this graph bottom right, the R-square value from correlation between our estimates and FIA came up to 0.92. So a really very strong correlation to the measurements done by FIA, which is a governmental program for inventorying forests, and they have huge resources of ground plots with remeasurement every 5 years for assessing parameters or inventory parameters. So this project, as I mentioned, allowed us to put together data from multiple platforms. So that's why I have this graph here of big data opportunities and challenges for technoecology, where the volume of data, it's really tremendous, coming from multiple sources, coming at you fast with various frequencies. What I didn't mention, and I'm trying to keep it within allotted time here, is that for that project, we also look at mapping disturbances for the IP project, and we look at disturbances through the land trender, and which is implemented through the Google Earth engine. So we really try to use a lot of the initial concepts that I mentioned for technoecology, all these integrated data sources available through even web-based platforms for you to assess some ecological parameters. So discussion, maybe look ahead. I propose you some terms, or not me, but I mostly cited that publication from 3 years ago of technoecology, ecoinformatics, and I'm quite happy to let you know that our department, once it got reorganized, we were also tasked with revising the majors that we offer, and now I was a very strong supporter of implementing this new major that's called ecoinformatics, since we realized there's so many interests in combining, fields like remote sensing, image processing, programming, with assessing ecological aspects. And we will have a major that's called just like that, ecoinformatics. It's yet to be implemented, but everything is approved at university level, and it's now waiting to have approval from the Texas Higher Education Commission Board, and hopefully that's happening soon. So I think it's pretty obvious that we are witnessing a technology-based revolution in ecology. Think about maybe an analogy to the invention of the microscope. We can now use all this technology to look deeper and better understand the structure of our ecological systems. This pace seems to be detected by the speed of which ecologists embrace and integrate such new technologies as they arise, and they seem to be pretty early adopters of such technology. So I just highlighted in the end a quote from Albert Einstein that we still do not know 0.001% of what nature has revealed to us. So we're still learning and digging into that small percentage and trying to better understand what's going on by using technology in ecology. So that's it from me. I just wanted to show you this metaphor of, using space-borne green lasers to, learn more about our environment. Sometimes, hopefully everything we learn, it's not getting us to the rage of the Hulk here. But anyway, thank you, and I'd be glad to listen to some of your questions. And while I do that, I'll play this video showing some drone data collected by students in my lab here.
Well, thank you very much, Sorin. Yeah, while we're looking at the video, I'll open the floor to questions. Anybody who wants to ask a question? So while you're thinking, I actually have a question or two that I've been pondering for a while now, actually. So Sorin, I don't work with the space-borne photon counting at all. And I was always curious, to what extent can you, during your filtering processes to remove noise, especially atmospheric photon noise, to what extent can you actually characterize sub-canopy structure with something like ISAT?
It's a very good question. So you see that those photons, in fact, have a pretty good vertical distribution. You have to remember that they bounce back to the sensor from that 14-meter footprint that is placed every 70 centimeters along a track. So within that, footprint, they can bounce even from within canopy elements. That's why the photon classification, in fact, looks at top of canopy photons, then what we call canopy photons, and ground. So the canopy photons are between top of the canopy and ground. So then those photons, once they're classified into those classes, they are used to compute some of those parameters that are well used by ecology, such as percentiles of canopy height. One of them being the medium height energy. And so there is penetration from the top, and there are metrics in the ATL08 product that try to capture that vertical distribution of photons that could be used for even sub-canopy characterization.
And do you see a similar, so if you integrate all the photons from top canopy to ground, if you integrate those over a larger footprint even, do you see it sort of mimicking typical waveform distributions, in other words?
Yes, exactly. Yes. Yeah. So very good point. Yes, just like with the, discrete return, integrating such points over a certain area, the vertical profile, the vertical frequency histogram of those points resembles a lot the waveform, the full waveform.
I have another question, but I'll first ask if anybody else has a specific question. I always wonder if the students are watching Netflix on the side while listening to a class or a talk.
One thing I was curious about, and I think I may have just missed it as you were describing that, is based on the overlap of the footprints, is every data point a single photon? Because I know it's probably fairly low signal, or is it a combination of the footprints that have overlapped and kind of summed together, where you've gotten multiple detections kind of at every location on the ground? I don't know if that question made sense, but I'm assuming it's truly like a single photon per location equals a detection. Is that accurate?
I think yes. So let me go back maybe to one of those slides that show the vertical structure of those photons. Okay, let's try this one. Yeah. So, or maybe this one right here. So those photons, once they're classified, they're represented along track like this with XYZ, and they are you can't tell what footprint they're coming from necessarily. So, but they seem to have this continuous coverage. Then the standard product averages those photon heights for 100-meter segments. So when we decided for 100-meter segment, that was prior to the satellite launch, and we looked at the expected point density, how many points we can have to really have reliable statistics for characterizing vegetation, and we came up with this 100-meter segment length. Now it turns out that we have the real data, in fact, is better than the anticipated and the simulated data, and we we find surprisingly that even the weak beams, which were sort of excluded from consideration for characterizing vegetation, are in fact pretty good and compare well to airborne lidar data, for example. So I'm not sure if I answered correctly your question, but just think of the analogy to discrete return lidar data, to discrete return points. So you have those points spaced along the track, and they can come along that track anywhere from a 14-meter wide area, basically, but they are mapped to the center of the track. And you can have normally 1 or 2, 3 photons per footprint. So spaced every 70 centimeter, you can have those photons coming back and being recorded, counted and recorded by the sensor. So imagine that kind of point density. Every 70 centimeters or so, you have 1 to 3. That's what we normally expect. Photons.
That makes sense. Thank you. Yeah.
The canopy.
And so maybe a little divergent question here. So looking at the panicles, the sorghum and so on, what do you think in terms of prognosis for comparing structure from motion, so image-based 3D sensing versus active lidar-based sensing? Do you think in many of these sort of short broadacre crops that structure from motion would replace lidar?
It's a very good question, and there are some controversial publications out there that look at structure from motion and lidar, but it depends where you have the lidar sensor. So, for example, for this research that we show to the right here, we placed a terrestrial lidar sensor. I should have showed that picture on top of a combine. Okay, so we artificially created a high platform to allow us to look at the sorghum field. And that's because at that time we did not have our UAV LiDAR. In the meantime, we haven't done a study with the UAV LiDAR, but I see that UAV LiDAR is becoming more affordable. DJI has come out with this integrated LiDAR sensor on a DJI drone. Unfortunately, we cannot purchase DJI drones because of restrictions coming down from the university. But anyway, I think UAV LiDAR, terrestrial LiDAR is becoming more mainstream, more affordable, and structure from motion may have a very strong competition soon from direct measurements of heights rather than indirect through photogrammetric methods like those implemented through structure from motion. In the meantime, structure from motion is very affordable. I mean, a DJI drone or other drone that costs less than $2,000 can create mosaics that are sub-centimeters and with a point cloud that's very dense and accurate, but it still has limitations. I mean, if you imagine the type of weather you have out in the field there, some wind will have those panicles move centimeters, right, or more between images, and you have then difficulties identifying those panicles on a slightly windy day, and it's almost always like that out in the field. So indirect measurements of heights like structure from motion have their own challenges, but they are extremely affordable for now. I do see a rise though in LiDAR, Jan, to conclude my answer to your question.
Interesting. I was wondering about that. Yeah. Are there any other questions out there on the floor? Well, Sorin, I want to say thank you very much. But if you don't mind, I might stop the recording in a second and then and have you just hang around if someone else wants to ask a question offline. Probably just steal another 5 minutes of your time if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah. But thank you very much for your time. It was really very interesting. I'm always fascinated by the photon counting because it's sort of the next advance in terms of lidar sensing. So it's really neat to hear direct from the horse's mouth, you know, and what's going on and what the research what research is happening. And very encouraging to hear that even though it's ICESat, it should be VegSat really, if you think about it, right? So anyway.
Yes. If I say that in one of those meetings, I may get in trouble with
there you go.
Of the NASA team, but I alluded to that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Sorin, and thank you for everybody for joining us. As I said, I'll leave the meeting open for another 5 minutes or so. Stop the recording, and then if you want to ask a question or hang around, by all means do so. But we'll go from there. Thank you, Sorin.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. That was interesting.